When I walked out of that office for the last time, my hands were still trembling, not from fear, but from holding everything in for too long. My jaw hurt, my throat burned, and when the elevator doors shut, I finally exhaled the lie I'd been living for years. You ever choke on your own silence? That was me, for 7 years, smiling when I wanted to scream, nodding when I wanted to walk out. People think workplace abuse looks like shouting or slamming fists on desks. No, it looks like a man saying, "You should be grateful I kept you after that mistake." It looks like smiling through tears because rent is due on Friday. It looks like dignity leaking out of you drop by drop until you forget what it felt like to stand tall. His name was Mark Ellison, Senior Vice President of Hensley and Company, my boss, and the man who turned my ambition into a leash. He didn't start out cruel. No, Mark was deliberate. He made you trust him first. He learned your rhythms, your insecurities. He'd call me the backbone of this team. In meetings, then later, behind closed doors, he'd say, "You owe me for everything you've built here, Claire." And the awful part? For a while, I believed him. Because when you work for someone who feeds your need for validation, you don't notice the poison until it's already in your bloodstream. Before him, I was proud of what I'd built, a small apartment in Chicago's South Loop, a career I'd clawed out of nothing, a reputation for being the woman who got things done. My parents used to call me the dependable one, the one who'd always land on her feet. I didn't realize I was already falling. The night it all cracked, it was February, bitter cold, the kind of cold that makes metal sing when the wind hits it right. We were finalizing a major account pitch, a deal that would have meant a bonus, recognition, maybe even a promotion. I'd done the entire campaign, every slide, every line of copy, every ounce of creative blood I had. And Mark, he took it. He stood in that boardroom, surrounded by men in charcoal suits and silver watches, and said, "This was my team's vision." Not my vision, not my work, just his name, his fingerprints on my sweat. And I watched him lie so smoothly it sounded like truth. Watched him smile, shake hands, and leave me invisible in the room I built. Afterward, he walked up to me, quiet, calm, the way abusers always are when they think you're too small to fight back, and said, "You'll thank me one day. I just protected your career." Protected it by stealing it, by erasing me. That was the night I stopped believing in hard work. The night I realized some men don't destroy you with cruelty, they destroy you with control. And I didn't know it yet, but that was also the night I started planning. Not for success, not for peace, for revenge. After that night, something inside me went quiet. Not broken, not yet, just quiet, like the world turned down its volume, and I was moving through it in a kind of muffled fog. I still showed up the next morning, heels clicking on the marble floor, pretending my heart wasn't splintering under my blouse. I smiled when people congratulated Mark on the pitch. I even clapped at the meeting. You ever fake applause so hard your palms sting? That's what survival looked like for me, performance. Every compliment he got was a nail in the coffin of who I used to be. A week later, he called me into his office. Door closed. Always the door. He was calm, too calm, flipping through a stack of printouts like nothing had happened. "Claire," he said, "there's an issue with your performance metrics. You've been distracted lately. Personal life, okay. Personal life, like I still had one. My mother was in hospice that winter. Late-stage lymphoma. I was barely sleeping, splitting time between her bedside and the office, living off caffeine and guilt. I told him I needed a few days off to help her settle her affairs. He looked at me like I'd asked for the moon. Then he smiled, that little half-smile I used to mistake for kindness. And he said, "Take the time, but remember, absence can make people replaceable." Replaceable. I carried that word like a curse. I remember walking home through sleet that night, the city lights bleeding into the puddles on the street, the sound of my boots against the ice hard hollow. My mother was dying, my work was being stolen, and I was expected to show up with lipstick and a smile. And I did. Because when you need the job more than the job needs you, pride becomes a luxury you can't afford. But grief has a way of making you sloppy. The day my mother passed, I didn't check my phone, didn't open my email, didn't care. I just sat there beside her, holding her hand long after the nurses said it was time to let go. Her fingers were still warm. Her wedding ring left a mark on my palm that lasted for days. When I finally came back to work, 3 days later, I found a note taped to my monitor. See me, Emmy. He didn't even wait an hour before he started. He told me I'd left him exposed, that clients had been waiting on deliverables, that my emotional absence had jeopardized his credibility. I stood there, hollow-eyed, trying to explain through a grief I couldn't name. And he cut me off with a sigh. Claire, if you can't balance your personal tragedies with your professional responsibilities, maybe this isn't the right environment for you. Personal tragedies. That's what he called my mother's death. I remember looking at him, really looking, and seeing for the first time the kind of man he was. The kind who feeds on power because he's terrified of being ordinary. The kind who mistakes cruelty for leadership. That was the moment the silence cracked inside me. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just said quietly, "You're right. Maybe it isn't." And I walked out before he could fire me. I wish that were the end of it. But when you walk away from someone like Mark Ellison, they don't just let you go. They make sure you bleed on your way out. A week later, he called a team meeting, said there had been ethical concerns about how I'd handled client data during the last campaign. Lies, fabricated emails, false records. He'd turned my absence, my grief, into his weapon. And just like that, my reputation was gone. No one returned my calls. Job offers dried up before interviews even happened. Whispers followed me across the industry, like smoke. He didn't just take my career. He took my name. That's the part no one prepares you for. How it feels when your name, the thing you spent years building, becomes poison in other people's mouths. The humiliation doesn't come all at once. It trickles in unpaid bills, unanswered texts, polite smiles from people who used to admire you. By the time I realized how deep he'd buried me, I was too tired to dig myself out. So I stopped trying. I sold my mother's car, broke my lease, and moved into a one-bedroom on the south side where the trains rattled the windows at night. I told myself I just needed rest. But what I really needed was a reason to get up again. And it came, oddly enough, from something small. One night, I opened my laptop out of habit to check emails I no longer received, and there it was, a job posting for a freelance communications consultant. A startup. Local. Anonymous listing. Something in me stirred, curiosity maybe, or defiance. I didn't apply right away. I stared at that blinking cursor for an hour, and then I thought, he doesn't get to be the end of my story. So I clicked send. That was the night I began to climb, not for him, not for a title, but for myself. And though I didn't know it then, the path that would lead to my revenge had already started. Because sometimes the best revenge doesn't look like fire. It looks like patience. There's a particular sound that lives in the walls of cheap apartments. The hum of someone else's TV through drywall. The thud of footsteps above you. The faucet that never quite stops dripping. That sound became my soundtrack. My life had gone from boardrooms and glass elevators to chipped paint and silence I couldn't afford to fill. For months, I barely spoke. Not because I didn't want to, but because no one was calling anymore. When people say they lost everything, they never talk about the logistics of it. The way your name gets flagged in HR databases. The way your references suddenly become unavailable. The way your inbox stays empty for weeks until you start checking it compulsively just to confirm you still exist. I pawned jewelry I didn't even like. Sold the watch my mother gave me for my first promotion. It barely covered utilities. The city that used to feel alive suddenly turned cruel. Every skyline light a reminder that I'd once belonged to something. I told myself I'd start over. I even applied to agencies, startups, anyone who'd listen. But the same look came every time. Polite smiles, thin lips, hands folded on desks. We'll be in touch. They never were. The thing about humiliation is, it doesn't kill you. It lingers. It sits at your table, eats your food, shares your bed. You start talking to it like an old friend. You stop correcting the lies people tell about you, because fighting them would mean admitting they got to you. I used to stare at my reflection some mornings and think, this is it. This is the woman who let him win. And some days, I almost believed that was true. Until the night, everything changed. It was late, almost midnight, and the heat had gone out again. I was sitting on the floor, wrapped in 2 blankets, scrolling through freelance listings that all seemed like scams when I found an email. Subject line, saw your name, worth a conversation. It was from someone named Dana, a recruiter for a small startup called Northlake Strategies. She said she'd heard about me, the real me, from someone who'd left Hensley and Company months earlier. She didn't care about the rumors. She wanted to meet. For the first time in months, I felt something that wasn't despair. I felt a pulse. We met at a coffee shop near Union Station. I remember the smell, burnt espresso, wet coats, winter air. Dana was maybe 40, sharp eyes, no nonsense. She asked about what happened at Hensley. I told her the truth. Not the polished version, the raw one. She listened without interrupting. And when I finished, she said, "We need someone like you. Someone who's seen how power works and still wants to do things right." It wasn't a glamorous job, contract work, small clients, but it was honest. For the first time in a long time, no one looked at me like I was damaged goods. The first few months were rough. My confidence came back in fragments. One successful project, one good review, one small check that actually cleared. But every time I sat down to write a campaign, I'd still hear Mark's voice somewhere in the back of my mind. "You owe me for everything you've built here, Claire." I started keeping a journal, not for healing, but for remembering. Every manipulation, every lie, every moment he'd tried to make me smaller. I didn't know why I was documenting it. Maybe it was anger, maybe survival. But the words became a roadmap, a slow reclaiming of memory. And then, something strange started happening. People who'd once worked under Mark began reaching out, quietly, cautiously. LinkedIn messages, late-night emails. They'd seen what he'd done to me, and now he was doing it to them. He was still at Hensley and Company, but cracks were starting to show. The industry was shifting. Ethics mattered again. And he was still playing the same old game, taking credit, gaslighting, discarding people when they burned out. For the first time, I wasn't the only one who saw it. I wasn't alone anymore. Dana noticed, too. She said, "Claire, you could build something from this. An agency that actually protects people like you. People who've been used up and thrown away." It sounded impossible, but impossible starts small. We began quietly, freelance work under a different name. Then one client turned into 3. 3 turned into 10. Within a year, I'd formed Monroe Creative, a communications consultancy built on everything I'd learned the hard way. Transparency, credit, boundaries. It wasn't revenge. Not yet. It was survival dressed as progress. But every invoice I sent, every client I signed, was another brick between me and the woman he tried to erase. And then, one afternoon, 2 years later, my phone buzzed. An email from Hensley and Company. They wanted to hire my firm. I remember sitting there for a long time, staring at the screen, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. The proposal came directly from their new executive director of marketing. I scrolled to the bottom, half numb, until I saw the name copied on the thread. Mark Ellison, the same man who said I was replaceable, the same man who built his career on mine, now unknowingly asking to pay me for my expertise. My hands shook, not from rage this time, but from something colder, power. I didn't reply right away. I sat with it, because this wasn't going to be the kind of revenge that made headlines. This was going to be the kind that left echoes. The first thing you need to know about revenge is this: it doesn't feel like fire. It feels like stillness, that kind of deep, unnerving stillness you only get after a storm, when you realize the world's still standing, but it's different now. When I got that email from Hensley and Company, I didn't celebrate. I didn't even smile. I just stared at the name Mark Ellison until it stopped looking real. I thought about deleting it. Then I thought about every night I'd stayed late rewriting his messes. Every time I'd swallowed his condescension just to keep my job. Every humiliation I'd carried like a bruise I couldn't show anyone. And I clicked reply, "Dear Mr. Ellison, thank you for reaching out. Monroe Creative would be happy to discuss how we can support your team. Let's set a meeting. Claire Monroe, founder and director." I stared at my own signature for a long time before hitting send. It looked foreign, powerful, whole. When the day of the meeting came, I arrived early. The same building, the same marble floors. But the woman walking in wasn't the one who'd walked out crying 3 years earlier. My reflection in the elevator doors didn't tremble anymore. I wore a tailored black suit, sharp lines, calm colors, no perfume, no disguise, just presence. When the elevator opened on the 12th floor, time folded on itself. Everything smelled the same, coffee, toner, that faint hint of disinfectant from overzealous janitors. It was like stepping into a dream that had waited for me to wake up. The receptionist looked up. "Name?" she asked. "Claire Monroe," I said, and her eyes flickered. Just a little. Recognition. Rumors, maybe. But no judgment. I waited in the same conference room where Mark had once stolen my work. The same gray walls. The same long table. Different me. When he walked in, it was almost anticlimactic. No thunder. No cinematic gasp. Just a man, older, thinner around the eyes, his hair graying at the edges. For a split second, I saw confusion in his face. Then disbelief. Then something small and sharp. Fear, maybe. "Claire," he said, like the word hurt his tongue. I smiled, polite. "Mr. Ellison. It's been a while." He cleared his throat, adjusted his cufflinks, trying to find his footing. "Yes, well, I didn't realize Monroe Creative was mine." I finished for him. He laughed too quickly. "Yes, yours." There was a long silence between us. Not awkward, just full. Full of everything unsaid. Every betrayal still echoing in the air. I could have thrown it all in his face. The lies, the false accusations, the ruined years. But that's not what power looks like. Power is calm. So I laid out my proposal, clear, professional, expensive. He tried to negotiate, of course. Old habits. I let him. Then I said, softly but firmly, "Mark, if you want results, you'll pay what it costs. You taught me that." His jaw tightened. He signed. When the meeting ended, he walked me to the elevator the same way he used to, back when he thought I worked for him. But this time he pressed the button for me. That tiny, stupid gesture nearly broke me, not from sadness, but from the weight of it. He said, "You've done well for yourself." And I said I had a good teacher. I didn't look back. For weeks after, I kept expecting to feel vindicated, that rush, that cinematic swell of victory people talk about. But what I felt was quieter, like the air after lightning. Our firm delivered exactly what he paid for. We didn't sabotage, didn't expose, didn't humiliate. We simply did what he never taught us to do, work with integrity. And when the campaign launched, Monroe Creative's name appeared publicly beside Hensley and Company. Equal partners. The industry noticed. People whispered. The same whispers that once destroyed me, now carried my name like a redemption song. Mark faded into the background after that. Retired early. Rumors of an internal review. I didn't dig. I didn't need to. Because revenge isn't always about watching them fall. Sometimes it's about rising so high that their opinion stops mattering. I still walk past that building sometimes, especially in winter. It's funny, it doesn't look any smaller, but it feels that way. The glass doesn't gleam as much. The light inside doesn't look as warm. I stand there with a coffee watching people rush in, And I think about the woman I used to be, the one who thought loyalty was safety, who mistook exploitation for mentorship. And I whisper, quietly, to the reflection in the glass, "You made it out." Because that's what this story really is. Not about him. About me. About every woman who's ever had to choose between her dignity and her career, and somehow found a third option: survival. And if you've ever been there, standing in that quiet, suffocating moment where you're forced to choose, I hope you choose yourself. Every time. Because revenge fades. Power shifts. But dignity rebuilt on your own terms, that stays. Forever.